Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode. My name is Dana Mantilia. I will be your host, and our guest today is Vince Scott. Hello, Vince. How are you?
Hello, Dana. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So before we get started, why don't we take a little minute just to hear a little bit more about Vince and what you do, what your company does, and all that kind of good stuff.
Sure. My name is Vince Scott. I'm the founder of Defense Cybersecurity Group. We're a cybersecurity consulting company focused on the defense industrial base and really helping companies both be cyber secure and meet their compliance requirements to the Department of Defense. We've been in business for about 2 years. I personally am a retired U.S. Navy cryptologist and information warfare officer. My last military role, I was the Deputy Chief of Intelligence Collection for Europe and Africa. I like to say I used to play offense and now I coach defense. And then over the last 12 years, I've been banging around commercial industry. This is actually my fourth new start, so I'm a serial entrepreneur at this point, and have really valued all of that time. Had a lot of opportunities to be inside a lot of corporations in their cybersecurity enterprise and see how they do business.
And is there any specific size or specific industry within the DIB that you focus on? Helping with companies?
We talk about being SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses, although our largest client is over $1 billion a year in gross. So we kind of covers the gamut. I think there are scale issues across that spectrum. I've obviously spent a lot of my time, though, in Fortune 500 sort of companies, so we don't have a problem really scaling up if that's needed. But I also understand, not every small manufacturer that's got 50 people doing stuff in Oklahoma is going to be able to afford, Procter and Gamble level of security outlay. And so you have to balance the needs of the business and the realities of where that business is at and what they can do from a compliance perspective, and where they're at in the industry and what the risk is in order to help them come up with the right solution for their business and their clients information.
Good. That's great. Okay. Well, is there how does people get in touch with you, or what's the best way to reach out to you?
Sure. Our website is at www.cybersecgru.com, cybersecgru.com. We're Defense Cybersecurity Group, and the contact information on that website will have somebody get back in touch with you.
All right. That sounds good. Perfect. It's funny. So I think there's something with the audio right now because there's a little delay with what I can see you saying versus what I can hear you saying. So it's just weird. That. Is mine doing the same thing?
No, you're in sync. I am not in sync for some reason.
I don't know how we fix that, but I mean, we can hear you crystal clear.
Yeah, let's try. I did the virtual background. Let's try taking that off and see if that fixes the problem.
All right. Now,
how about without the virtual background?
Now it seems to be working properly.
Yeah, the virtual background was taking too long to bring the video forward, I think.
Okay. All right. Well, it was fine during the beginning part. I mean, it was literally the whole part when you were talking about your organization, it was fine. So we could leave that. We could just cut it out, or if you want, we could do it again, whichever you prefer.
No, that's fine. We'll just cut somewhere in here.
This out, yeah.
And the virtual background will be off. My real background isn't that bad.
No, it's not at all. Okay, great. All right, so now I'm going to start off with. All right, so today our topic is going to be scope. So this is a very important one. So the first question we're going to talk about with this is, what is scope and why is it important?
So scope in the CMMC DoD compliance context, right, defines what is a covered defense information system and what isn't. If if you read the language out of the Defense Acquisition Regulation Supplement DFAR 7012 that really sets the standards for what we need to be doing for cybersecurity under CMMC, you'll find that it uses that covered defense information terminology. And scope really is not something the regulation talked about. We originally had, so the regulation says do 171, NIST 800 Special Publication 800 171, primarily. It says other things too. And then CMMC says we're going to inspect you against or assess you against NIST 800 171 under the CMMC assessment methodologies. Originally, when we started looking this, in NIST 800 171, in the beginning, there's a single paragraph that talks about, or actually a single sentence that talks about scope. And it says, process, handle, or store CUI, or provide protection for. And the regulation, when it defines what's covered, it says process, handle, or store. But when you go on to 171, it adds that or provides protection for. And then under CMMC, they took that half a sentence and made the scoping guide, which now governs how we're supposed to look at scope when we're talking about a CMMC assessment of our, meeting the regulation and the CMMC certification. So it's really important because it says what needs to be assessed and what doesn't.
Well, what's really interesting too, I'm glad they're putting some regulations or some rules or some guidelines or whatever you want to call it together for the assessors, because it's only fair to make sure everybody is really following the same interpretation of what they think is being done properly or not properly. And if one assessor is stricter than another assessor, then that may be leading to a little, not necessarily fair.
That's a really hard problem. The more information, the more we try to structure those regulations, it seems we almost create more gray areas than we erase. And that was certainly the intent of the scoping guide. And everybody was really looking forward to having the scoping guide because there'd been a lot of discussion around that one half a sentence. And what does that really mean? And how are we going to assess the edge and all that? So then the scoping guide came out, but it brought with it some new questions and challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and everybody, it's like the echo chamber of all the CMMC professionals picking and arguing over, well, this means this and this means this, and so hopefully everybody will get a little bit more information so that we can.
That's all fine and good until we get into actually doing assessments.
Right. Yeah.
And I think once assessments start, which they are, starting under the Joint Surveillance Program now, and those decisions actually have to be made, we're going to get some case law and some precedent. One of the things I really like about C3PAOs is the C3PAO forum, which is run by Amir Armand and some others, primarily over the collaboration forum Discord, which really I think has a majority, a significant, like 80 or 90% of all the C3PO companies or prospective companies are at least represented there. I think, and we are talking about this as assessors and trying to baseline that stuff across ourselves. Hey, how did they deal with this? What did DIBCAC, the DoD version of this, say? How did they deal with this under the Joint Surveillance Program, et cetera? And so hopefully that will bring some consistency in execution, if not as, if we still find challenges in the way it's written down.
That's great that you guys have a place where you can collaborate and talk to each other about stuff like that, because you're absolutely right. That's the best way to get everybody on the same page is opening up those lines of communication between the people that are going to be going in and actually doing the assessment. So,
yeah, absolutely.
All right. I know I got a little off track there, but okay. So here we go. So how do you define scope for an environment and where do you start?
So for under CMMC, and I think we should caveat all of this is, in the CMMC context, you really define scope in your environment by using the scoping guide. And the first thing that the scoping guide does is demand new work that we didn't have before. And that hasn't been talked about a whole lot, but there is new work in the scoping guide, because the scoping guide directs that every asset in your organization be categorized in one of 5 categories. And that has to be written down somewhere. So we, under CMMC 1.0, we had an asset management domain. It didn't have very many controls in it, but we did have a domain. That domain went away under 2.0 as we retroed to just 171, which does not have an asset management domain. However, we really have to have a lot of asset management, particularly under configuration management, but also to a lesser extent under access control. If you look at the first control, 3.1.1 under access control, that first set of things requires you to limit devices connecting to the system, which leads you to having to have a database or a list of all the things that are authorized to connect so that you can do that controlling. So it's critical, and it has been critical, to have an asset management mechanism or database. Now, under the scoping guide, though, the new work is, even if you've been doing that perfectly, everything has to be categorized as one of 5 categories. And so I think the place where you start with scope is that categorization of your assets in accordance with the 5 categories in the scoping guide. Now, those 5 categories are CUI asset, so controlled unclassified information asset. That's something that process handles or stores, CUI. Security protection asset, which goes back to that, or provides security for, CUI. Contractor risk managed asset, CRMA, which is connected to the system, the network, the enclave, but is not intended to process, handle, or store CUI. It doesn't say couldn't possibly ever, and it's not required to be physically or logically separated, but it's not intended to be a CUI asset. And then you have a specialized asset, which are things like OT, operational technology. So if I have a lathe that's plugged into the network, that would be considered an operational technology or a specialized asset. And government furnished equipment is also a specialized asset. I've seen that a couple of places where the government has actually issued laptops or devices that they want stuff done on to keep it on their hardware. And those are also considered specialized assets. They're in scope, but they're not subject to the full requirements of all CMMC controls as written in the scoping guide. And then the last category is out of scope assets. So those may be things your company owns, but they're in your database, but they're not in scope for a CMMC assessment. So I think by categorizing everything in your asset management database, that's where to start. Because then scope starts to become obvious, because you know what your CUI assets are. You know what your security protection assets are. You know what those other categories are, both CRMA and specialized asset, which are in scope but not required to do everything that a CUI or a security protection asset is required to do. And that now you can start to sit back and go, oh, okay, so this body of things is what's in scope.
So I hope the people that are watching this that are thinking that they have to get CMMC certified are realizing that they really do need to be dealing with a professional that knows CMMC inside and out, because everything that you just said, like the back of your hand, and non-technical business owner, it's just their eyes are just going to glaze over. So they need to be working with somebody that is as aware as you are about this stuff, and someone that can help them to figure out what it is that they have, because it does get very complicated very quickly for non-technical people.
Yeah, and that's something that we see quite a bit for companies that have been going it alone in this. And oftentimes they think they are meeting the requirements and they didn't understand what the requirement meant. Probably every time I've gone in to do a gap assessment on someone, at least once, and generally several times, I've said, okay, how are you meeting this control? And they give me an answer. And I go, that's a great answer. It applies to some other control. No, really, how are you doing this? This means blah, 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 blah. And they go, oh, we didn't know that. Every time. And so that's not the experience you want to have when your company is on the line and you've paid for an expensive certification, and then you find out you have some major hole because you didn't understand the requirements.
Yeah, and so that's a big deal, which this ties into our next question, which is, how do you know if you're ready for an assessment? And if you're doing this on your own, or if you're doing it with somebody who really doesn't know all the details, and you think, yeah, we're ready for an assessment, and then so you sign up for assessment, it comes in, this is all money and time that is getting spent, and you might have to have something done by a certain date in order to get a contract. So now let's say you fail the assessment, now you got to get somebody to come back in. So that's what people need to really understand with the severity and how much they really need to look at this and get going on this right away. So going into this question is, how do they know if they're ready for an assessment?
Yeah, so I think the best way to know if you're ready for an assessment is to do a mock assessment ahead of time. And that could be one that you perform yourself or with your consultants. It doesn't have to be, I hired a new C3PO to come in and do this independently. But going through that process of looking at how am I doing? Now, under the new CMMC rules, and this is sort of off the scope question, right? But under the new CMMC rules, what they have said they will contain is a requirement to do a basic self-assessment every year. So basic self-assessment is where you go in and you score yourself and you report your score to the DoD. The more rigorous and accurate you can make that process, that's going to really help you get ready for an assessment. And the more you can make that basic self-assessment process, CMMC assessment-like, I think you're helping yourself. So by doing it with evidence, by making sure that when we say, oh yeah, we got that. Okay, show me. Where's that written down? Do I have that thing? From a scope perspective, can I draw a scope diagram? Do I have something that describes my scope in my system security plan? I got that written down. So you're not ready for an assessment if you can't tell yourself what the scope is. And I talked about a controlled unclassified information assets and security protection assets. So it's the two big ones, right? And then I kind of know where my scope is from there. But if I don't know what is CUI and I don't know where it is in my environment, categorizing everything might be extremely difficult. So understanding where you have CUI may be a precursor activity. And so if you're looking down the future, hey, I need to get certified in this CMMC thing. And immediately what happens in 95% of the companies, they turn to IT and say, take care of this. And the IT guy goes, so what's CUI? And the business says, well, we don't know, just take care of it. Mm-hmm. The IT guy is never going, or gal, is never going to be able to answer that question because they're not in the business generally. They're not dealing with the customer. This is a whole of business problem. It's not just an IT problem. And the business has to help IT answer that fundamental question of what is CUI and where do I have it in my organization? And how do I manage where that goes in my organization? So getting your hands around what is CUI and how your business just fundamentally is handling it. How's this working today? And then let's look at ways that we can herd those cats into an enclave, limited set of assets so that we can then accurately mark everywhere that is a CUI asset, and that then helps determine our scope, and the rest of these things lead from that.
IT and cybersecurity protection is more important than ever before. Subnet Systems helps local businesses with computers, networks, and cybersecurity. They have great relationships with their clients, communicate in a language that's easy to understand, and bring peace of mind to their clients that they are secure and protected from cyber criminals. Subnet Systems is known for their expertise in managing IT services, protecting against cyber attacks, data backup, and disaster recovery. For more information, please visit subnetsystems.ca.
Yeah, and I would say one very important thing that all the business owners need to realize is that this is not something you can just say, "Hey, Mr. IT guy, you got to take care of this," because that's not going to work.
Yeah, that would be one of the big things that I said to business owners in this is turning around and saying, "Hey, IT guy, just take care of this." And I do see that quite a bit, and it's actually particularly challenging in larger organizations. In my larger clients, this is largely viewed as an IT compliance problem, and they have more problems sort of getting the business on board with, hey, you're part of the team, man. We need you to not only help us define this and what needs to be protected, where that critical data is, but we also need you to be a partner with us along the way to continue to follow the controls that get set up under the compliance program.
Okay, another question here. So this, I think we just talked about this a little bit, but do you need to have an inventory to define scope?
Yes, absolutely. So if you don't have an inventory, I don't think you can combine scope, because you can't make that decision of what asset category does this belong in. And I've gone back through that recently with a client, right? They have an asset management database. I'm like, okay, we're going to go through here and we're going to have to decide every one of these assets, whether it's, what kind of asset it is and how we make that decision. There's actually, for those who are professionals in this space and really want to understand scope better, the Amira Aman's CMMCaudit.org has a white paper that I contributed to. She primarily wrote about scoping challenges. We used 12 different scenarios and sort of went through, and it seems like it would be a straightforward decision, but actually you find when you get into the nitty-gritty details, you go, I'm not sure where this one fits. We address a lot of those questions and have recommendations on how to deal with that. And we've built a flow chart on sort of the decision-making process to go through on what category an asset falls into that I think is really valuable.
And that's a great website that she has too. There's a lot of really, really good information on there for people. So that we highly suggest you take a look at that. So that's great. Okay. All right. So yes, you definitely need an inventory. I don't know how anybody could possibly think that they're not going to need that, but we just covered that. Okay. So what is a security protection asset and how does it fit into scope?
So security protection asset, now we're beginning to start to touch on gray areas that continue to exist in the standard. Security protection asset is anything that provides protection for a CUI asset. And largely aligned across the professional assessor community is if I mention something in meeting one of the security controls or security requirements across the 110 in NIST 800-171/CMMC, then that's a security protection asset. So, if we say we set our perimeter with our firewall, well, then the firewall is a security protection asset. Some of those are obvious. Firewall is probably the most obvious one. Okay. But what about my time server? So you're required to synchronize the time across your environment. That's a security control. And if what that thing that I use to establish base time is now a security protection asset, right? And that could be exterior to your organization, like the NIST time server. As you read the scoping guide for detail, in the table on page 2, it says that security protection assets are to be assessed like CUI assets, which leads you to a full stack CMMC controls. It's got to be treated just like a CUI asset. In the write-up, it talks about applicable controls, right? Security protection assets must meet applicable controls, and there's been a great deal of debate about what's applicable. And the reason for that is, and my time server is a great example. Do I have to prove CMMC controls on the NIST time server? Does that really make sense? Can I do that? No, I can't do that. How would I, NIST hasn't even thought about that. They don't consider it something that requires a FedRAMP certification, et cetera, because it's NIST. Who knows what the security protection and controls around that server are, but we use it to meet a security control. So continues to be a debate in the community about whether or not a security protection asset requires full stack CMMC, or we should evaluate it based on the security controls it's supposed to be meeting. So like, does the time server do what it's supposed to do and give us accurate time? Well, yes, it does. Okay, so it's good for that applicable control. I think we're coming down on evaluated against what it is supposed to be doing rather than all of everything. However, that still isn't terribly clear. The opposite end of this is I have a managed service provider who has remote access to my environment. So they can reach in and change things, change files, change firewall rules. I've outsourced all or a lot of my IT to somebody else. Well, what part of their environment now constitutes a security protection asset, and what is our requirement for them to be compliant? I think this is, that's the opposite end of the scale from the NIST time server. And I really think this is analog across security protection assets. Some offer more risk than others. That remote monitoring and management capability, that RMM capability, is probably the high end, and the time server is the low end, right? And it's everything in between. We're not sure yet how that's going to be addressed. My recommendation to clients today is, at a minimum, you should have a shared responsibility matrix with your outsourced provider. So this is something that goes through all 110 controls and says, hey, you're doing this, we're doing that. And, they at least self-attest that they are meeting those requirements rather than being certified by an independent third-party assessment. I think that's a good middle ground for now while this gets worked out. The C3PAO forum, which we talked about earlier, also has a web page and has published some papers. One of the key ones on there is our recommendations to the DoD on inheritance and how to deal with this in the managed security provider space. I don't know that we've really received any feedback on that from the Department of Defense. We put it out there as the C3PAO forum to try and influence this, seeing the challenges with where this could go inside the Department of Defense. My personal take and recommendation is that we can't start reaching into these outside entities to do assessments for the DIB. One, it's a rabbit hole from which you could never escape. It could balloon costs tremendously to the OSC. And I don't know, and we have a limited number of assessors out the gate, and I don't think we want to balloon assessment requirements currently. It's not that there's not risk there, and not that there's not a valid argument potentially from a regulatory or legal perspective that is also needs to be evaluated. However, I think that the community and the Department of Defense and the protection of their information will be much better served. Hey, let's stick with getting those OSCs up to speed. Let's make sure they've got multi-factor authentication in and kind of an inventory, and they're tracking where their CUI is at, and they know where it's happening in their community, and they're mitigating their risks and all that stuff before we try to solve the internet's problems with security. Particularly, I think we face a challenge in that the standard as it's developed over time develops from a concept around IT that is 10 or 15 years old, in my view. We started the journey in the government, with OMB Circular A130 and FSMA and all of that back when really IT was primarily an on-premise thing. You bought your servers and you had your file server on site, and we were building our fortress to protect that in digital land. That's not the way it works anymore. Companies, new start companies today aren't buying any on-prem infrastructure. No new start company is going out and going, man, I got to have a server and I need to get some hardware in here. They ain't doing that. That's not how this works. They're all going to the cloud. And so whether you like it or you don't like it, or you see security problems or not, the fundamental premise of IT is actually changing significantly beyond the vision we had when we wrote the foundational controls. And I think there's some unwillingness on the professional community's part, particularly those that are very comfortable in the 853 FSMA government space. They've been living in this government, ATO, this is how we do business space for a long time. And now they're kind of coming out into, hey, we're doing just a subset of these controls in contractor land, and we're going to do it just like we do in the government. They don't see that change and don't care. Hey, you contractors just need to, get with the program, and we're finally going to enforce security. That's an approach. However, I don't feel that it is the optimum approach for the defense industrial base or the Department of Defense. I say this all the time: slow and steady wins the race. Let's get a little bit better tomorrow than we were yesterday, so that in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, man, I'm way better than I am now, and not just say, oh, the problem is too big, I can't get there from here, let's punt it down the road 2 years. No, let's get a little bit better tomorrow. And I use that in my clients. Perfection is not an achievable goal. Let's just get better tomorrow than we were today, or next month than we are now. And I think that pays a lot of dividends. And so I bring that philosophy to my outlook that we need to take this one step at a time. And I think that would be biting off more than the assessment community and the Department of Defense really want to bite off. And I think it potentially would break a lot of things and actually make security potentially worse rather than better.
Well, I also think that this is why a lot of companies have just completely avoided doing anything with cybersecurity, because it gets to be too much and they just say, forget this. If every single organization in the DIB just had multi-factor authentication, that was it. Right, we would be eons from where we are right now, and
absolutely,
they could understand that. They could understand. Okay, you have to install multi-factor authentication. Okay, all right. Now everybody's done that. Okay, now the next thing is to do this. So when it's in these little bite-sized things, people can understand them and digest. Okay, we did that. That wasn't too bad. I think that was the thing with CMMC version 1, where it was just crazy, and it was all consuming, and everybody and anybody and. So I think that's where the biggest problem is, exactly what you're saying, is that we have to just do a little bit, and then, okay, we did a little bit, then we do a little bit more, so it doesn't mean 5-10 years down the road, all these stringent things aren't going to be in place. They probably are, but we would have built our way there, as opposed to just dumping people this on them all at once.
And I think we can modify the approach, not in the regulation. Regulation is really hard to change, and we have this problem that regulation is not going to keep up with IT. We're never going to get away from that. Hey, we started building these rules 15 years ago, and now they're finally getting enforced, and now we decide that IT isn't like it was when we made the rules, right? So that's a challenge I just don't think we're going to get away from, but I think we can control and mitigate and really make it executable based on our approach to assessment, right? That's because at the end of the day, that's what people are going to do, is what they're held accountable to. So by focusing the assessment approach the right way, we can make a huge difference in that, and we can drive that. Hey, here's where we're going to assess, now, and okay, now I'm I'm changing the rules slowly over time so that I raise the bar. I think that would be a really smart approach to take that. Robert Metzger, who's one of the great speakers in our community, I think, has put that forward a few times about, hey, let's focus on what's most important first. Why don't we try to go get that done against our most important information and not worry about solving all the world's problems all in one fell swoop?
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, we have one more question and then we got to wrap this up here. So let's just talk about the assessor and what are they going to look at with scope during the assessment.
So the first thing is, when you go to schedule an assessment, the assessor is going to expect you to tell them what your scope is. That's part of the CMMC assessment process. Sit down with the organization seeking certification or OSC and say, okay, what's your scope? And you got to be able to answer that question. So, from a scope perspective, you got to understand your scope up front and be able to tell the assessor what your scope is, not expect the assessor to come in and go, oh, well, I've defined the scope as this. Now, the assessor may challenge your scoping decisions in some ways, but if you sit down at the table with the assessor and say, scope, my environment, IT. Now that's not going to go well. And so you could have an assessor walk away from you and say, I'm sorry, you can't scope your environment. I can't assess you. When you figure that out, come back. And so I think that's the first thing about how assessors will look at scope. The second thing, I think, if you do a good job of that, of defining what your scope is and having a reasonable argument about why your scope is the way it is, I think the assessor is going to go, okay. So there's a lot of gray area here, and there's, I talked about Amira's and a little bit of my paper that me and several other people contributed to, but that's 60 pages we used to try and get our arms around this problem. So it's not easy, but you got to make a call. And you're the person in charge as the OSC. This is your environment. Make a call. And I think if you make reasonable calls and sit down with the assessors and say, here's what I think my scope is, here's why I think that is. And it's based upon you understanding your contracts and where CUI flows within your environment. And I think if you've got a decent story there, I don't really see an assessor nitpicking you or trying to throw you off or change your decision making, et cetera, because there is gray area, right? Because it maybe isn't as defined all the time, and I could do this or I could do that, and I'm not sure. Okay, I got to make a call. That's one thing I do see at times. As a prior military guy, I'm very much in that. The best thing you can do is make the right decision. The next best thing you can do is make the wrong decision. The worst thing you can do is not make any decision at all. I am a huge believer in that philosophy, and I see a hesitancy at times to make decisions. So decide what your scope is and go into that meeting talking like you know what you're talking about. And then the last thing I think from an assessor perspective is assessors are going to look at this. Scope defines what they look at. And those things that are out of scope, I'm not looking at those. I'm not spending time on those. I'm not asking you about that part of your environment. So I have a client who has 3 major sites. One of them solely deals with DHS work, and the other 2 deal with DoD work. The third site, we're marking all out of scope from a CMMC perspective, right? From a CMMC scoping, it's a CUI under DHS regs, which may change and that blah, blah, blah. But from a CMMC DoD perspective, all of that stuff is out of scope. Doesn't apply to them. Now, from a security perspective, we're trying to do their security well too, but not to think that we just threw them off the raft. But from a scope perspective, not in scope, not DoD. So you need to think about that as you put together what your scope is, and that's how I think assessors are going to look at it.
Perfect. Well, this was very, very, very helpful. A lot of really good information here. Thank you so much for your time with all this.
Thank you for having me, Dana. I am really happy to be here. I think more interactive things like this are great, and I love your show.
Oh, thank you.
I think you're trying to push out good information to people in bite-sized chunks where they can get it.
Yes. And luckily, I've had a lot of great people that are willing to help me like you do these interviews. So thank you. All right. Until next time, everybody, take care. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.